Hey folks, and welcome back to the least knowledgeable sim racing channel, in a video where we're going to explore the origins of that title. 2021 has been a very slow year for sim racing, at least insofar as my channel goes. Most of our big content came out last year in time for the lockdown-inspired sim racing boom, which was absolutely crazy. Conversely, 2021 has been more about settling into a new normal and working out ways to re-pivot the channel and think about the future of things. Before thinking about the future too much, however, I wanted to circle all the way back around and address a couple of the loose ends that have been hanging over us for the last couple of months. The view among some in the community is that I've fundamentally changed the way that I think about certain sims and sim racing as a whole. And to cut a long story very short, the answer to that is yes, I have. I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes explaining why that's actually a good thing rather than a bad one. But in order to do that, we want to circle all the way back around to when I first started sim racing because context is very important. It was as recent as 2015 with the release of Dirt Rally. With my T500 RS in hand, I had an absolute blast because I had just transitioned over from controller for the first time ever. I wasn't overthinking the physics, I wasn't really overthinking the minutiae, I was just enjoying the driving experience more as a game rather than a sim. As time progressed and I realized that I had a fully fledged sim rig that I was only using for one game, I thought to myself, why not use this opportunity to step up to something a little more realistic? And the more I asked around and the more I looked into the scene, the more I kept hearing about this infamous Assetto Corsa. So, looking into AC, which at the time was a few years old already, I managed to pick it up for a steal with a lot of the DLC content. I booted up into AC for the first time, navigating its somewhat awkward menu and getting into a very small oval track with a road car. I believe it was the MP4-12C, which at the time was my favorite road car. I very quickly realized two things. One, I had no idea what I was doing, and two, this is something that would hang over me for a few years beyond this point, is that I fundamentally didn't really gel with the physics engine nor the force feedback feel of AC. So, to point number one, I quickly realized that I had no idea about brake markers, car control, how to get it through the corners efficiently, and I just barely fumbled my way through a couple of laps. To the second point, I could never quite get my T500 RS feeling all that good with AC, and I quickly abandoned it in favor of greener pastures. A few weeks after that, Project Cars 2 was released. Project Cars 2 was the first time that things really connected for me with a more real sim. I used this chance to start learning the Nürburgring Nordschleife for the first time ever in 3 separate segments before ultimately putting them all together into the one track. And of course, because I was way more of a rally guy at this point in time with not much knowledge of track racing, I was still driving primarily road cars like the GTR, the Audi R8, etc. I used this opportunity to learn the fundamentals of track driving, such as trail braking, apexing, accelerating out of apexes, racing lines, and all of the things that we take for granted as sim racers. And as I did this, I challenged myself by working all the way up the time trial boards until I had a couple of first places at the very end. Not too bad for somebody that was several seconds off pace to begin with, that barely knew the track and barely kind of knew how to get the car around the track. So I owe a lot to Project Cars 2 in that regard. Obviously, over time, the cracks in the facade began to show. I started to realize that the black hole curb effects, the really weird bouncy behavior of the cars, and just the general spottiness of the quality level really didn't put Project Cars 2 in the best place. Bear in mind that this was the first time I'd really kind of connected with something outside of Dirt Rally. The bounciness, the dynamism of the physics model, I always felt like there was more potential in the Madness engine than Project Cars 2 got across. During this time, I kind of alternated between AC and Project Cars 2, trying to find the best compromise, but I was never truly fully engaged and fully happy. I kept hearing about this legendary tire model in a game called rFactor 2. People would bring up rFactor 2 almost as an afterthought. If you really were past everything else, you didn't care about the user experience, the multiplayer experience, the sounds, the graphics, anything, but you really just wanted the ultimate physics experience. And at this point, because I'd already explored so much, I thought, well, what else do I have to lose? I mean, I need something a little bit more engaging. So I got rFactor 2 when it was on a 50% sale, and I got into it. almost as if I knew what I was doing, I got a ripped version of the Nordschleife and Spa, and these were the only two tracks I raced in rFactor 2 at the very beginning. Now I still remember the very first time I booted into a track in rFactor 2. It was the Nordschleife and I was driving the vanilla Civic that comes with the game, so front wheel drive. The sensation I felt through my belt-driven wheelbase was unlike anything I'd experienced in any other sim. To say that after the first couple of corners what I experienced was bliss is to understate it. I connected with that sim, its physics engine and its driving feel unlike anything before. I mean, things I had struggled with to feel out in AC, to feel out in Project Cars 2 became a complete afterthought in rFactor 2. It felt so natural and so straightforward to drive. It almost felt like going into my actual road car and immediately knowing the limit. This began what would be a many-year-long love affair with rFactor 2, and anybody who knew this channel in the early days would be no stranger to that. I came out onto the scene very strongly proclaiming my love for rFactor 2 and doing a lot to actually promote it to the wider audience. So, as time went on, ACC came out, and eventually AMS2, Automobilista 2 was announced. Now, this was right around the beginnings of 2020. This was as my channel was still geared towards action RPGs. I thought to myself, well, we've all been locked down. I have nothing else to do and I need to keep myself sane, so why don't I try and repivot my channel back towards sim racing? And I thought AMS2 would be the perfect way to do that because it seemed to be striving to be right in the middle between ACC and rFactor 2. So ACC at the time was still what I personally would consider underdeveloped in the handling front. It still felt a little bit on and off, a little bit all in or all out. There was just not that much feel or play on the limit. Curb behavior was still kind of bizarre and it was kind of wonky in some strange ways. But the graphics were immaculate, the sounds were immaculate, the user experience was really well integrated, so it had a lot working to its advantage. Meanwhile, rFactor 2 was the complete opposite. I considered it the king of physics, but definitely not the king of graphics, sounds, user experience, and all the myriad of other things we've well covered by now. AMS2 seemed to be taking that kind of dynamic approach to physics that rFactor 2 had and incorporating it with a modern graphics engine, modern sounds, modern presentation, more into a tight, neat package. And that kind of created an intrinsic hype toward AMS2 for me. I kind of rode that development cycle, I rode that hype, which I generated for myself during that time as they continued to develop on AMS2 towards the latter days of their early access period. Now, I was genuinely extremely excited about AMS2. There were a lot of updates which improved the game, there was a lot of potential in the handling model, there was a lot of work that needed to be done, but you could tell that it had the right ingredients to be what it needed to be. However, about 6 months down the line, I realized that the sim felt like it was just treading water. That's not to say that Reza weren't actively developing it, it's quite the opposite. They were releasing a ton of new cars like GT3s, DTM, classic open wheelers, tons of new tracks, all kinds of different things. However, because AMS2 was built around being a bit of something for everybody, all of these were filling out disparate classes, and it made it very difficult to get a proper grid going on any one discipline of racing. As a result, it was very difficult to build a community around AMS2, and the player counts gradually dropped off, as did the hype around the sim. For myself, personally, I came to realize that many of the changes they were making were just kind of squiggling left and right, rather than clear-cut improvements on the sim as ACC had been making over that period in time. So the force feedback engine changed more times than I can remember, and a lot of the physics elements changed repeatedly over time, which made keeping car setups completely pointless, made it very, very difficult to actually cover the sim in any great detail because anything that you would say on a given week could become completely invalid on the subsequent week and the subsequent release. That was one of the reasons I naturally kind of fell out of love with AMS2 and stopped featuring it on the channel. There was very, very little to actually speak about that could last the test of time. That being said, if you're one of the few that hung around long term and are one of the core AMS2 community base, more power to you. Reza currently probably needs you more than ever as they're still actively developing on the sim and I'm sure doing everything they can to get as much as possible out of the Madness engine. Meanwhile, during this time, my love affair with rFactor 2 was kind of blossoming. So, I'd started things on a ripped version of the Nordschleife with the vanilla content, but over the time that I owned it, the new developers, Studio 397, had just released their first properly laser scan track, Sebring, and their GT3 pack. And I remember seeing this on a point of view racing channel. It absolutely blew my mind the way that those cars were moving on that track, the way that they were bouncing on the potholes, the way that the cars were interacting with one another. I'd never in my life seen anything like that before, and it just further entrenched my love affair with rFactor 2. Anybody that knows the channel from these early days knows how much of a fanboy I was. Now, as time went on and I kept featuring rFactor 2 repeatedly and getting more embedded in the community and getting to know the people behind the scenes, I started to get the odd comments here and there from people saying, hey, it's really cool that you're enjoying rFactor 2. You may not realize this, but you can very easily break the physics, and here's how. Now, you may or may not realize this about me, but I'm actually always open to change and always open to changing my views and opinions if shown a better way of thinking about things, so long as that way is respectful. So I took some of these posts and I created a bit of an itemized list for myself. I wrote down what they were saying about minimum tire pressures always give you the quickest lap times. You can lower the rear wing to the lowest value and offset it by using the rear sway bar all the way off and then bumping up the front sway bar. And then you can actually neutralize the camber more to help you with additional grip in this sense. So all of these things sounded very bizarre to me, obviously, because they don't really translate to real life. You can't compensate for a lack of aerodynamic grip by using more mechanical grip, right? They don't interact in that way. But unfortunately, turns out in rFactor 2 they did. I tried out many of these things that I was told, and I found out that there was a kernel of truth behind them. While dismayed, I continued still driving in rFactor 2 as they released their amazing Nordschleife track. I was absolutely in love with it. I drove it for several hours a day just on a Nordschleife, getting better and better and better with the GT3s, until eventually this culminated in being invited to the first 24 hours of Nürburgring Invitational event in rFactor 2, which was an absolute hoot, mega stressful for myself, driving at all crazy hours of the night, but what a great way to start multiplayer racing and sim racing. One of the problems during this process was that because it was an endurance race, I went into it with a preconception thinking, well, I have to drive conservatively. We'll be on medium and hard compound tires, obviously, and I need to drive in order to conserve those tires. But the moment we had our first coaching session, the guys were just like, no, push. Like, you got to push, you got to accelerate through all the corners, keep rotating the rear end on power while running softs. And all the while I'm doing this, I'm like, okay, well, I'm getting much quicker lap times, but I don't understand. How is this going to work over a full stint? It turns out that the way the tire compounds are coded in rFactor 2 are quite wonky. I mean, there's very, very little utility to the medium and hard compounds. Most people just run softs, irrespective of the length of the race. And just the way that certain ins and outs work in terms of how they build temperature, how quickly they wear, what pressures you run, just kind of weren't that congruent with the real world. And at this point, the facade began starting to crack for me with rFactor 2. As much as I was still having fun with the sim, seeing how people were getting their times at the top tier was kind of a little earth-shattering for me. A couple of weeks after this, I was invited to the 3 Hours of Spa invitational event with the late William Marsh. Now, this was where things really started to crumble for me because I saw the setups that we were running in order to stabilize the car. I saw the way that people were driving, and above all, I kind of just saw the times that they were getting, which made absolutely no sense under the circumstances because of the way that you had to drive. And after this all took place, after we experienced the litany of bugs that we did, after all the inconvenience of trying to run these rFactor 2 multiplayer events, I think it all just got to me. And speaking in the modern day right now in May of 2021, I think the last time I booted into rFactor 2 may have been about 3 or 4 months ago, with the exception of trying to record tutorials for Overtake GG and outlets like that. But I have not willfully driven in rFactor 2 for many months, and I think that last experience was one of the big catalysts for that. Meanwhile, during this time, the sim I'd always use as a benchmark for graphics and sounds and user interface, but not much else, ACC, was gradually still developing its physics engine. Each new update was incrementally making the driving experience better and better and better, while all these other sims were kind of either spinning their wheels, so to speak, or either going in reverse, or it seemed like that the management structure had no clear end goal on how to fix the gaping holes in their sims. Now, this was definitely the case in rFactor 2. The more I got a glimpse into the management structure and their priorities, they were still prioritizing the competition system and the UI at the time, when I'm like, why do you care about this when the driving experience is so fundamentally broken? I realized that my goals were kind of at odds with what were my favorite sims at the time. So I naturally moved back and I tried ACC again. Now, it's hard to quantify where this was exactly, but somewhere in between Fanatec issuing a ton of driver and firmware updates to the DD1 bases, me upgrading my sim rig, and me kind of getting disenchanted with the other sims I was driving at the time, ACC just finally came alive. Somewhere in the last few updates, it just finally clicked and finally made sense. I've been very fortunate due to this position to be put in touch with some real-life motorsport drivers, a lot of the people who code behind the scenes, a lot of the people who plan and manage behind the scenes, and the general consensus is that yes, ACC is currently the best, most well-rounded product for GT racing, as would be evidenced by the fact that it's currently being raced in the GT World Championship by real-life race car drivers being put up by Fanatec and actually vying for real points as part of those virtual races. So there are a lot of very difficult pills for me to swallow in that time, and I want to circle back around to the idea of changing your opinion not fundamentally being a bad thing. See, in my spare time, I tend to read a lot of philosophy. I follow a lot of public intellectuals, if you will, such as Sam Harris, Zizek, Jordan Peterson, etc. One of the things that marks their attitudes is, when presented with overwhelming evidence, they will over time incorporate that into their own consideration and alter their opinion. And I've always been of the opinion myself that you should be open to change. If you're shown that you're wrong, empirically, unequivocally, you have to internalize that and account for it. I mean, it wouldn't have helped anybody had I just stuck to my guns and said, rFactor 2 is the king of physics, nothing else comes close, it's the most dynamic physical time model, and meanwhile I'm just drifting the car with minimum force feedback on the power all the way through all the corners at high speed. It would make absolutely no sense, and it would be of no benefit to you guys either. So this is the most genuine way I can think of conveying the fact that yes, my opinion has changed over the course of that year, but it came with no vitriol, it came with no ill will towards any sim racing developer. My earnest hope is that all of these sim racing developers can get all of their respective sims to the highest level possible, and we can use all of them as a form of real life race car driving, that we can all feel a sense of completion and immersion with whatever our respective favorite sim is. Currently for me, that sim, for better or worse, happens to be ACC, and I give massive props to Kunos for that, because AC, without a doubt, started off being my least favorite proper sim, and now ACC is my main. I think it's a testament to hard work over time and a clear managerial structure. That's one thing I feel that some of the more esoteric niche sims currently lack. Anyway guys, that was a very long form way of me trying to explain why things have changed the way that they have over the course of the last year. I hope you can get on board with it. Whether or not you do agree or disagree, that's the great thing about this industry. You don't have to take everything I say at face value. Look into it yourself, form your own opinions, and see what you think. That's what I did, and it's one of the reasons that my opinions have changed so vastly over the course of the last year. Notwithstanding the fact that I started with the humble T500 RS and now have load cell pedals, a very rigid rig with a DD1, which is a vastly different experience to experience sim racing with. Anyway guys, make sure to smash that sub to stay up to date with future sim racing videos. Future ones should be coming very, very shortly. Until then, I'll see you guys later.